I ought to share just really a God story about how we got Senator Hall involved. You know, when I first was assigned the duty to lead our Secure the Grid coalition to address this threat of electromagnetic pulse, my boss at the time, Frank Gaffney, said, we're going to go to Texas first. I want you to go to Texas first because it has its own grid. And so I didn't know anyone in Texas, right? But I knew that there was going to be an inauguration of a new governor, Governor Abbott. I figured, well, that's probably a good time to meet people. And I called Dr. Pry and I said, Dr. Pry, I need you to fly to Austin with me so we can go find someone who would be a champion for protecting against EMP. And if you remember Dr. Pry, incredible man, sometimes he would be impatient, rightly so. He's like, hey, who are we going to meet with? Well, you know, doctor, I don't really have a plan just yet, but I've been doing a lot of praying, right? And I was praying for somebody that would allow us to speak to them about EMP. And so I picked Dr. Pry up from the airport. We drive to the Capitol, and he's looking at me. He's like, well, Tommy, who are we meeting with? And I said, well, I hate to admit that I still don't have a plan, but I've been praying. And, of course, his patience is drawing thin. And we get to the Capitol, and the first one, as we walk in to the elevators, a man steps into the elevators, just the three of us. We introduce ourselves to him, and he says, hey, my name's Bob Hall. I was just recently elected to the Texas Senate. What are you guys here for? And so Dr. Pry explains, well, we're here to find someone we can talk to about nuclear EMP. And do you know that Bob Hall then immediately just looked at us and said, nuclear EMP? He said, it was my job in the 1960s as a U.S. Air Force officer to protect our Minuteman missile systems, the ICBMs, nuclear weapons, from EMP. And Dr. Pry's eyes just lit up. And all of a sudden they realized they both knew all the same people from the 1960s and 70s and 80s, the people who protected our nuclear weapons against EMP. So I looked back at Dr. Pry and I said, I told you, I may not have had a plan, but I was praying. I had a prayer, and it was answered.
Wow, I love it. What a story. I mean,
Dr. Pry was one of our dear friends and appeared on our show
many times.
Many times.
Mm-hmm.
And he was the voice crying out to fix the grid. And when he passed away, is there someone, maybe yourself, going to take Dr. Pry's place crying out to America to fix the grid?
Amen.
Yeah, Pastor, that's my duty, to carry that torch. I mean, our Secure the Grid coalition, we decided we now call it the Pry Project, and in his memory. And you know, I feel a calling, just the same calling I had in uniform to serve this nation. I continue to keep my oath to fight for this U.S. Constitution every day, but I find myself in a place sort of between Ezekiel and Noah. And let me explain. You know, Ezekiel chapter 33, right? The duty of the watchman on the wall. That's what we do at the Center for Security Policy, is we look for the threats. We sound the alarm, because if not, then the blood's on our own hands, right? We have a duty to sound the alarm. But as people ignore those warnings, I also feel a bit like Noah, where at some point you got to start building an ark. And so, you know, I would like to emphasize something that Dr. Pry did say. You know, we talk about the threats to the grid, the threat of electromagnetic pulse is very scary. It should cause people to want to be more prepared. I would tell you, I am much more prepared than I ever was before I knew about this threat. But what Dr. Pry reminded me was that the founders of the country, the founders of this nation, they faced tyranny, right? But yet they could have run away from it. There was an infinite frontier to run to. So we think about EMP, we think about the grid. A lot of us would like to just run to the frontier, right? You make your grid down retreat site, right? And I'm not saying I don't have one of those, okay? But the founders didn't run to the frontier. They turned and they fought tyranny, and they won. And so we need to fight the tyranny of inaction. So yeah, we should be prudent, we should be prepared, but we also need to get involved. And from the bottom up, if the federal government wants to ignore this, that doesn't mean that your state, your county has to ignore it as well, right? And so I think if the people get much more involved, then we can make a difference in fighting that tyranny of inaction.